Trying to teach yourself to draw from imagination is a roller coaster of frustration. I am going to show you the steps I personally took to be able to draw people from imagination. All right, so in order to draw from imagination, there's a couple objectives we need to consider. One, we need to be able to create a simplified body that we can rotate in our heads. Number two, we want to be able to put down this pose onto paper very quickly. Now, both of these objectives sound like a tall order, right? That's because they are. But we're going to use a simplified method to construct everything. So now, usually, what people tell you to do, and it's not generally bad advice, it's just not useful as a beginner. They tell you to draw this egg shape for the rib cage. Okay. And personally, it's really hard to figure out the rotation of an egg shape in space. So you want to avoid the egg shape for the rib cage, and you want to avoid the underwear shape for your pelvis, because it's, from a beginner perspective, the underwear shape is too complex to rotate around. And remember, we're trying to go with simplicity here. All right, so let's get into proportions real quick, and then I'll show you how to do some poses after that. So bear with me here. This is the size of the rib cage, okay? And I've cut it in half. If you take the size of the rib cage and you add that size below it, half of that size is going to be the face of the pelvis. And then, as you can see from my reference images, the pelvis is actually kind of rotated. It kind of tilts forward. So that takes up the top part of the half of that first half, so like a quarter. So then you take another rib cage size, you put it on top, and this is where your head is going to go. And the head is a third, or the head, if you go 2/3 up, if you go 2/3 from the top of the box, so there'll be like a 1/3 gap, that's the head size. So just remember, the head is 2/3 of the rib cage, and the face of the pelvis is half of the rib cage. I feel like that's a whole lot easier to remember than drawing out heads like that. And then you just take your head, your rib cage, and your pelvis height and double that, and you got the height of the character. The legs are the rest of the height. The elbows fall just below the rib cage. Knees are about half. But the main thing you want to focus on when you're rotating poses is the rib cage and the pelvis, and then secondarily the head. If you get the rib cage and the pelvis right, if you get that drawn in perspective correctly, you honestly don't even have to worry about the arms and legs, because they'll just kind of like fall into place more naturally. So learn the rib cage and the pelvis first. That's what I highly recommend you do. And so what I want to do is erase these and show you the same proportions, but with perspective boxes, because that's what we're going to be drawing. Because remember, the first objective is to be able to have something simple that we can rotate in our heads. And the simplest thing to draw is a box. It's also the easiest thing to find the depth of. So as a beginner artist, you start out with boxes. Then you can transition to more complicated things. But first we learn boxes, okay? And when I'm drawing my boxes, I like to draw a center line down vertically, Okay, so and then I draw a horizontal line in the middle of the rib cage for the bottom of the pecs. And then for the pelvis, what I like to do is draw another center line. The center line that you draw on the objects helps you define it in space. It helps you find perspective. So I try to draw a center line at least vertically on all the boxes. And then for the pelvis, I'll do like a triangle, an upside down triangle on the corners connecting to the center line, just kind of like looks a little bit more like underwear. And these marking the front like this also helps me distinguish where the box is in space. The back of the pelvis, a lot of times I'll mark an upside down triangle on the top. But anyways, for the head, what you want to do is divide the face into thirds, and from the bottom up, the you got the bottom of the nose, and then the next third is the eyebrow line, which is like 2/3. Then on the side, you want to divide it in half, and your ear goes behind that. The nose line extends out back a little bit, so you have more of a head shape. If you're struggling with that, that's fine. Just do a rectangular shape. All right. But I want to focus on poses because I feel like that's the main thing that people really struggle with. So I tend to draw the rib cage first. I'm not going to say I draw it first every time, but when drawing, it helps a lot if you think of big to small, where you draw the biggest thing first and then the smallest thing. And so you draw the biggest shapes, and then you just keep getting smaller and smaller until you draw the details. The details are the smallest thing you can possibly draw, so you don't really worry about them. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm drawing the rib cage as a box. And once I have this set in space the way I like it, and I move on. Now, if you haven't really studied perspective and you're struggling to get it in perspective, you can still do the box. Just draw what they call an isometric box that it looks like a 3D box, but it's not true to being like actual 3D in real life. But it's more important to get the boxy form down and getting it looking 3D in space than worrying about perspective. But if you understand perspective, then yeah, go ahead and do the perspective at the same time. You can always fix the perspective later if you need to. So I got my rib cage, and then I draw the pelvis. I just kind of connect the rib cage and the pelvis with a line, like it's like connected with strings. It's that way the boxes don't feel like they're floating as much. They feel more like they're connected, like they're united. And I don't want to get like too involved with drawing like anatomy or anything. I just want them to be connected. I've also used a sphere. If you've watched a lot of my past tutorials, you will see me use a spear in between the pelvis and the rib cage, and that just, like I said, it just helps me connect them and visualize them. I also find it easier to rotate things around a sphere in my head. So, or you can just use a string because it's a lot simpler to draw. And then I use circles or spears for all the joints. And you can see at the top here, I've connected the two shoulders with the, I can't remember what it's called now. But I've connected them because you have that little notch at the bottom of your neck where the bones go. Someone in the comments going to tell me the name. I cannot for the life of me remember what it's called, but knowing the names of anatomy is actually not that important when it comes to drawing. It's just important when you're trying to tell somebody something. And then I just use lines for the arms and legs. It's easier if you draw the joint and then you connect the two pieces. Like, so for instance, with these legs, I would draw the circle for the knee, and then I would connect it, the pelvis to the knee, and then could potentially draw another circle for the ankle and then draw a line to that. Same thing with the arms. I would normally, or I wouldn't say normally, but it's easier if you draw like the hand first or the elbow first, and then you connect a line instead of just trying to draw a line and get it in the correct position, because you already have the correct position to begin with. And then for the feet and the hands, I usually just use like a simplified box. I guess at this stage is not really as important. You're just trying to get the pose right. And what I'm drawing here is this guy throwing something. So he's got his arms stretched out. Now, if you're struggling with drawing arms and legs in perspective with just lines, then skip the lines and just use cylinders, because cylinders are a whole lot easier to draw in space. I personally just find it easier to draw lines and worry about cylinders later. So I'm going to draw a spear here, and probably a shield in his hand, his other hand, just to make it more interesting. But just by using these simplified boxes and shapes, I got something that looks reasonably like a person. So step one is learn the proportions, which shouldn't really take you that long to memorize. Then step two, you take the proportions you've learned and the box shapes, and you try to apply them. You draw poses with the box shapes that we talked about in step one. I highly recommend that you draw without photo reference and with the photo reference. Because one, our goal is to draw from imagination. Well, my goal was always to draw from imagination. And what I discovered was when I'm drawing, I spent most of my time learning to draw from photos. And then when it came to drawing without reference, I really struggled. And it just, what it really is if you want to be able to draw without reference, you're going to have to actually practice that and find out what you actually know. And you'll find out the more you do it, you don't know jack squat, because you don't retain information when you're just drawing from a photo. So drawing from a photo and then without a photo really shows you what you're retaining, what you're learning. And so, see, then I just add the cylinders later. And you can take it as far as you want. Now, at this stage, you don't want to be too concerned about... You don't want to be too concerned about getting things to look like actual people. Like, you don't want to worry about movement as much. It's okay if it looks like a robot. You're using very basic shapes. At this stage, at step two, your main goal is, can I get these boxy shapes in the pose I want and to look like a person? If you can get an achievable pose looks like it's 3D, then you're successful in step one. And one thing that you can do, and that I like to do, is I will connect the feet or whatever part is touching the ground with a plane and then kind of fill it in. And that helps describe that, like, grounds your character so it doesn't look like it's floating. And it also adds perspective. It shows the perspective a little bit. And it's just kind of giving a base for your character, kind of like little figurines. All right, so we're going to do another pose here. And you just want to draw as many poses as you can with these boxy forms till you get comfortable with it. Now, notice I said comfortable, not master. Okay. You don't have to master the skill. You just have to be proficient at it to where you feel reasonably good at it that if you needed to draw just about any pose, you could probably figure it out with just boxes. So you want to reach that point before you move on to step 3. So right now I'm just showing you examples of how I would draw a pose in boxes with boxes. And as you see here, I'm drawing really slow. I'm taking my time. And that's what you want to do at this stage. You want to just chill, sit back, relax, make sure you get it correct. But if your box looks a little off, it's okay. You don't even have to be as precise as I'm doing it. Here, you just want to be able to make sure that it looks like a box in space, okay? And you can add the stomach like I did in the previous pose, but it really doesn't matter. Like at this point, your main goal is, can I get the rib cage in perspective correctly? Can I get the pelvis oriented correctly and attach the head, the arms, and the legs to it with it looking reasonably well? And I don't know about you, but I find this method of just drawing boxes, like in rotating them, freeing, instead of trying to draw complex forms of like the underwear shape. The underwear shape for the pelvis is, really popular and it's really useful, but it has a lot of sides to it. And I honestly feel like from a beginner's perspective, it can actually confuse you. So until you're more established, I would recommend not using the underwear shape. And I use a neck. For the neck, I usually, I can't talk right now. So I also use a string for the neck. Like you can use a cylinder, but my idea is it's easier to draw a line than it is multiple lines. And when I'm drawing things from my head or my imagination, they tend to get really fuzzy quickly. So the quicker I can get that down and the simpler I can get that down, the better. And I lost some footage. For some reason, my device wasn't recording, so you missed me drawing the arm, but you didn't miss that much. And I just drew like a stick for the hand just to kind of represent that the person is planting. And then draw the shoulders. So it's all about using simple geometric shapes to define the figure. I feel like this box, I drew it, it's not long enough, or I guess wide enough, I should say. So I'm going to change that. And I hope that you appreciate the real-time drawing. I know that it makes the video longer and slower, but seeing me make mistakes and changes and seeing it slow down, I hope that's really useful to you. Now I'm going to cheat and I'm going to just move this box closer because I had it too far away to begin with, which you can't do if you're on pencil and paper, but you'd have to erase it, but that's fine. And then I always draw circles for the connection points on the leg. That's not actually how our joints connect, we don't, but it's just really easy to visualize it as you have this orb here and things rotate off of this orb. So the knees, ankles, elbows, shoulders, leg connection, those are all spheres. And a lot of times I'll just use like a wedge shape for the foot. And sometimes I struggle with getting the line where I want, so I'll rotate the canvas. And then draw a line connecting all the points touching the ground. Now I could connect the backside of that and make like a triangle, but I'm not going to. And I guess we need to put this other arm doing something, so just kind of have it up here somewhere. It doesn't really matter for the pose. Because at this point, I've established the pose, right? He's kind of like leaning down on his arm. So I probably do one more pose, and then we'll head to step 3. I think I've established well enough like what you should be doing. Do like a sitting pose, maybe. One thing I do want to say is don't spend all your time practicing. You're going to burn yourself out. I learned this the hard way, and I would burn myself out because all I would do is I would practice, or I would just do tutorial after tutorial after tutorial, and I would study and I would practice. And then I would go months without drawing because I was so burnt out and I didn't want to draw. So to combat that, what I would do and what I recommend doing is spend half the time, or at least 60% of the time, trying to draw what you actually want to draw. Even if it's something super complex and too hard, you try to draw that. You draw what is fun to you. So, for instance, if you enjoy drawing polar bears, then practice drawing with your cubes for a little bit, and then take a break from drawing with cubes, and then just go flat out at it and draw a polar bear to the best of your ability, even if it looks wrong, because you want to have fun. If you're not having fun, it's actually going to slow your progression. And it took me the longest time to figure that out. And even today, I still get in the habit of, I got to learn this. So let's say you realize that you suck at drawing arms. So normally what I would do is I would spend a week, if not more, just drawing arms. And I'd spend so much time just learning how to draw arms and focusing on arms, I'd start forgetting other stuff I learned, like, oh, well, now I can't draw the head. And it would just be this revolving door of, I have to study this forever. And then, I forgot how to do this. Now I have to study this. So I would go study the arm for a week, and then I'd study like the leg for a week. But I never would just sit down and just draw. I wouldn't just doodle. I wouldn't just make things happen. All right, so just get your hands dirty. Acknowledge that it's not going to look good. It's going to be very ugly, but you just try to draw something that you enjoy doing. And then go back and practice your boxes. Okay. I'm gonna draw this arm really close. All right. So let me know in the comments if you like this formatted video more, where even though it's slower, like I'm drawing in real time and I'm drawing slow down and more realistic, I guess you could say, as opposed to what I normally do, where it's a sped up time lapse and then I kind of do a voiceover over it. So I'm really interested to know what people think, if they like this setup better. Which one do you prefer, the time lapse style or these longer videos where I try to break it down slowly? Okay. All right. And so their legs are up. And there's really not much else to say on step 2. You're just taking these boxes and orienting them to look like human bodies. So after this figure, I'm going to move on to step 3, which I'm almost done. And draw a ground plane real quickly, squiggle in some shading. That's good enough. It gets my point across. Okay. Move that over there. I think I just want to clarify it a little bit better so you can see the parts. All right, so step 3 is when you want to start focusing more on rhythm and movement and the line of action. And you've probably heard of line of action before, but so I'll go over briefly showing this photo. And you want to draw from the head down the body towards like usually a foot, or usually it's a foot, but if it could be a hand if they're standing on it. You want to get the leg that they're standing on. You just want to get this long flow throughout the body. And then I'll use lines to mark the angles of the pelvis and the rib cage, just to help me orient them in space. I actually marked the angle wrong here, so I just made a quick adjustment while I was drawing the rib cage. And once you've reached this stage, you don't have to focus as much on boxes. I would say it would be better, like if you just, like let's say you just got done doing step 2 and you feel strong enough and confident enough in your abilities to move to step 3, I would draw the boxes. Then soft erase them down if you're working traditionally, or digitally you can just lower the opacity and then create a new layer. Then draw the rib cage inside it. That helps you gauge. But you want to focus on the body rhythms. So you want to learn the rhythms of the body, which is really based off of the muscles and how they interact with gravity. So rhythm, gravity, and then you want to start using more shapes that look closer to actual anatomy. So now you can start using like the underwear shape or the egg shape. I like to stay more towards boxy shapes, or kind of like rounded boxy shapes, like cuboid shapes. It's just easier, again, to manage, but you can start making it look a little bit more like an actual person. And this is where you want to start studying things like arm anatomy and stuff. But really, I wouldn't go at this point, I wouldn't deep dive into, okay, this is how you draw a bicep, this is how you draw a tricep. It would be more like, this is the shape of the upper arm, and this is the shape of the upper arm from various angles. And this is the shape of the upper arm when I'm punching or when it's flexing. And the same thing for the lower arm, the legs. So it's more about, again, simplified shapes, simplify everything. So I draw my simplified mannequin here, and then I'm going to soft erase it. And you can see actually that I'm using more like rhythmic forms, like lines are a lot closer to how a human body would move. And that's what you want to do. So, like, for instance, when a leg is facing you, there's actually 3 moments. The thigh curves on the outside, and then it curves around the knee on the inside, and then it curves again down the calf. That's the rhythm of the leg when it's facing you from the front, but it's completely different from the side. But it's the front and back are pretty much the same. So you want to study these rhythms by studying pictures of actual people. And it's easier if you find photo reference of people where they're wearing the least amount of clothes as possible so you can actually see their muscles. So now that I got this basic structure established, I'm going to draw some anatomy over it. So this is where like you'd start studying like the pecs, the abs, the deltoids. I start making it look a little bit more like a person. That's all I'm really doing here. And this is really this is a step you always see people do on YouTube, but for some reason people rarely talk about step 2. I feel like step 2 is the most crucial part. So if you just jump into step 3 without studying boxes in step 2 and how they orient, how they move around in space and connecting them as a person, that makes this really hard. But because we did step 2 first with the boxes, it makes studying muscles 10 times easier because we're not having to figure out how to pose the character because we already know how to pose the character. So now we just have to figure out how to layer details and more interesting structures on top of it. Let's do another pose and draw quicker here. Do an archer pose. So this goes back to having fun with it. Instead of doing just like someone doing jumping jacks, try to come up with something more interesting. Like, oh, I'm going to draw an archer jumping and maybe shooting an arrow. So again, I drew this simplified structure first. The rib cage and the pelvis, and then the stick arms and legs. And then I go back over it again, drawing forms that look closer to actual anatomy. And this is also where you want to study clothes and how folds are affected in different material. So one thing that I've noticed happens a lot with new students is, because I just gave a recommendation. It's like, oh, draw people with little clothes, so you're drawing people in their underwear and you're drawing people in your underwear from photo reference, and you're doing this a lot. And you do this so much that when you finally get out of that phase and you're ready to move on, and you go to draw your actual character from your imagination, and you just hit this wall because you're like, well, my character's actually wearing clothes. And you don't know what to do because you've never drawn clothes before. So you definitely, at this stage, you want to find photo references of people with clothes and study that. And what I usually do, so when I'm drawing from reference, or I should say when I'm creating my own character, I want to use reference not to figure out the pose, but to figure out like what type of fashion should they wear. Like, well, okay, what if I'm drawing somebody from medieval times, the Renaissance, or sci-fi, or even the 70s? Like, I go to that time period, like find photos of people in that setting, and I use that to inform my decisions rather than finding a picture of, well, I don't know how to draw this pose, so I have to find somebody in this pose, and I'm kind of a slave to whatever camera angle is in that picture. You want to get out of being a slave to photo reference in that regard. You want to be able to pose your characters however you want, and then figure out how to drape clothes over them. This one is just a photo of a girl hanging from a rope. So I'm just kind of copying what she's doing. And I want to make sure that I emphasize the arc in her stomach area. Like she's bending backwards. So I want to make sure that is apparent and that she's kind of hanging from this rope. So step 3 is where the fun really starts happening, where you can start making your drawings look more like people and the characters that you want. Kind of reminds me of Spider-Man, actually. Okay, so I'm going to do another photo reference here. And this one is just a guy holding a two-handed sword about to strike. So again, center line, angles of rib cage, angles of pelvis. I draw my rib cage, I draw my pelvis. And see, I'm not 100% sure sometimes. Even though I'm looking at a photo, I have to erase and change it. So I draw my knees, and I draw my lines to my knees, representing the legs. And elbows. And one thing that does help when you're trying to get your characters look more believable, or you're drawing from reference, or you're studying reference, is think about what is that person doing. Not that, oh, this is an elbow, this is a tricep, oh, this is a knee. No, you focus on the action. This elbow is bending. This fist is punching. You want to focus on the action because that's going to help you make your characters look more alive. Okay. And so step 4 I was going to include, but this video is already getting super long. So I think what I'm going to do is do step 4 in another video. I hope you found this useful. And now that you know the steps to drawing your poses, check out this next video where I show you how to draw female characters with different body types.